Nook and Nancy, merci tout le monde, attendez ici. I'm going to switch to English because my French is not great. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands, the Kayanknahaga Nation, the custodians of the lands and the waters in which we gather today. Chercheur or Montreal is historically known for being the place of many First Nations. Today it's home of a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We continue to respect the connections between the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relations with Indigenous and other people in the Montreal community. For those who have low vision, I am a middle-aged white male in my office. I'm wearing glasses, and from the look of things, I'm in dire need of a haircut. What I'm going to do today is kind of give a very brief and I hope light overview of open science. I was talking to Nancy beforehand, and I said that pretty much any of these concepts I could spend a whole 3-4 hours on, but this is supposed to be a sort of a general introduction into open science and why it's important. So if I just share my screen. There we go. So can everyone see the slides okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. So when I say open science, what most people think of is open access publishing. And we will talk about that today and about the different types of open access publishing, but really open science goes much further beyond this. And if we think about science in general, traditional culture, the incentives that we have in academia and in research create an environment where scientific inputs, outputs, and processes are often closed, accessible only for a fee, or only available between researchers and their collaborators. And open science is really a movement away from this type of culture and incentive. Open science is really the practice of making science in a way such others can collaborate and contribute. Whether this is data, lab notes, other research processes which are freely available and under terms that allow them to be reused either as is, reanalyzed, or for others to reproduce the research that we're actually doing. So it's making it more accessible, and in many ways it's more equitable for researchers across not just Montreal, but across the world. The government of Canada has this kind of nice wheel of describing the life cycle of open science. And it really kind of falls into 4 main areas. The idea of developing and sort of finding those research questions, so the ideation of research. Then we talk about the research questions and determining how we collect, that data. So data collection and analysis. The third stage is often publication. So, transmitting the findings of our data. And then the last part is knowledge mobilization. And, this can be engaging citizen scientists, the community, politicians, our funding agencies, which in turn kind of feeds into the next round of ideas of research. So it's very much a cyclical process where each stage of open science feeds into the next one and hopefully drives research forward by doing this. And if you think about it, it makes sense. As scientists, we're trying, and researchers, clinicians, we're trying to tackle innovative problems and challenges which are occurring in our community. And often, especially in rehabilitation, we want to engage with clinicians and study research questions and find ways of providing better rehabilitation or assessing the impact of rehabilitation with our work. So, engaging with our community, engaging with clients is a big part of that ideation of coming up with the research questions that we're interested in. Open science also really encourages citizen science. So one thing that's come out of open science is that anyone could kind of go along and use these materials to redo your research. It doesn't necessarily mean other researchers or clinicians, but it could be anyone who has the necessary equipment could actually do that type of research. And it opens up the possibility then of doing research beyond the confines of our research lab or beyond the clinic. So you could imagine researchers around the world being able to replicate your work with their, the clients that they see in their rehabilitation. So you can look at, cross-cultural questions, or, are rehabilitation services the same in every country, or are there differences there? And, if you think about it, if all our methods were online, if all the data are online, and all the algorithms we use to analyze or produce that data, how much more research could actually be done? So it's kind of an interesting sort of posing question that, by having access to this, it opens up lots of opportunities, and it also allows our research to, often the big criticism of what we do is that we tend to have a small, convenient sample. It's who we have available for us. Well, this is open science as an opportunity to break out of that mold, to allow us to go test lots of people from a very different backgrounds, to have a real true sample of participants in our research. It also allows us to encourage access to publications. And, I think I'm old enough to remember having to write to researchers to ask them to send me a copy of their paper. I'm showing my age now. But, research has become a lot more accessible by the advent of the internet, but there are still paywalls where you sometimes have to pay $45 to $100 to access a research article. And so open science allows you to kind of break through that process by getting research out faster in the terms of preprints, but also making the research more accessible to the community and to the users who may use that research to develop public health strategies to feed into their own research as well. So, why should science be open? Well, ultimately, we're all accountable to funding agencies or governments, but even just to the taxpayer. Having open science allows greater accountability in what we do. It also increases reproducibility of our research by others being able to go on and use the same methods to run the experiment. They can confirm our findings or not. It allows us to engage openly with various public members at different levels to boost confidence in science. I think we've seen this during the pandemic where there's been this strong very strong discussion about the science around vaccinations and the public health strategies, and how some of the public engaging and open access provides people with the data to show that various things actually are having an impact. It actually reduces duplication as well. So you can kind of, if someone else has done this experiment, well, you can either replicate it, or you can say, well, someone else has done this already. Let's move on to the next idea. It creates opportunities to increase the impact of our research by having the research freely accessible and the materials that can be used. Those materials can be reanalyzed, but they could also get to the knowledge holders much faster. It increases diversity and inclusion as well. So many, we live in Montreal, we have a certain type of participants that we can recruit, or clients that we have. But there are certain barriers there. There are financial barriers, there are geographical barriers, and open science allows us to sort of bypass a lot of those barriers to make, research accessible to all, but also for others in remote communities to potentially add to our research and representation of hard to reach participants and clients. It also accelerates knowledge transfer. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we do this today, but you get your knowledge out faster. And especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, that's been critical in allowing researchers and companies to develop vaccines at a much faster rate than has previously been observed. There are a number of other reasons why we should do open science, and this is because it's going to become increasingly part of what is required for research funding. So in February of 2020, just before the pandemic, the Government of Canada produced what is called the Roadmap for Open Science document. And there's a link at the bottom. And I should have said this at the very beginning. All the slides are available, and I've put them in text accessible. So if you need to access them through a screen reader or want to use the links, they should all work in the PDF. So we've started along this path already. So any kind of federal research now has to be accessible within a 12-month window. But this roadmap goes much further than that. So one of the big things in the roadmap is that by 2025, funding agencies want to implement FAIR open science requirements. And FAIR, it stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So the idea of this is that our research should be accessible. People should be able to find it relatively easy. It should be in a format that allows others to use it and would have enough information to be reusable by others. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about this later on and how we can sort of do this. It's not as scary as it sounds. But the government has tasked all federal funded agencies to develop and roll out develop the plan over the next year and to roll this out by 2025. So we're all going to have to do this if we're federally funded. Here in Quebec, most of the open access policy, and there's a link here in the slide as well to the current policy, relates around peer review publications and open access. So the current requirement is that if you are receiving funds from the province, either from a funding agency or directly from the government, that you should make the results of the research available no later than 12 months after it's published. So you can either do this through an open access journal, or you can deposit the final publication in an institution or a disciplinary open access journal or repository. And again, we'll go through how to do this today. Importantly, in December, the FRQ announced that this is changing as of March of 2023. As of March in 2023, there is no longer a 12-month delay. Research must be accessible as soon as it's published. Now, there's a lot of discussion that has to happen, and this is a whole other talk that we could have about embargoes and publishing copyrights and all this sort of thing. But this is the aim of the Quebec government, is that by March of 23, that all research will be available immediately upon its publication. Now, there's a number of open science success stories out there, and some of them you may be aware of. So the software, so Linux is a very classic one. It's an operating system. It's open source. The statistics package R. There's a word processing language called LaTeX. GIMP is a open source version of Adobe Photoshop. And has a lot of the same functionalities, but is completely free. There are numerous collaborative data sets out there. So Stats Canada is a good example. The Canadian Longitudinal Studies in Aging is another example. And most recently around COVID, there's been a lot of sharing of information between different governments and health bodies about, the COVID rates. And obviously knowledge translation is important, so that, open access publishers are becoming quite frequent. So I just put a bunch here, which are, PLOS ONE, scientific reports, frontiers are some of the big ones. There are preprint repositories where you can put up publications as soon as you're about to submit them to journals, so that they're available faster. I mean, obviously things like Wikipedia and Scholarpedia are other publicly available open access resources as well. So there are a number of tools which are available to do open science. And what I want to do today is really sort of spend a little bit of time talking about how you can use some of these tools to start getting involved in open science. And these are small changes that we can make to our research habits that would allow us to engage and start implementing some of the principles of open science. So if we start off with open ideation, so coming up with research questions. So obviously community engagement is great, but often, as researchers, we would often start looking for what's been done before. So, there are reference management software out there. Zotero and Mendeley are both two open access versions. Mendeley is owned by Elsevier. So, maybe that eventually would lead to it being a paid and more restricted setup, but Zotero is a completely open source package. There's plugins that you can have on your internet browser. So when you find an article of interest, you click the plugin and it downloads a PDF and all the information for you. And then you can kind of search around in your database to find papers of interest, or sort of build up a reference list of articles that you want to do on a certain research project. One of the newer tools which is available at CRIR is something called Connected Papers. And this is a really useful interface. So I've got a screenshot, but it works something like this, where you put in either the paper of interest or a search term, and then the software will actually find and visually represent it here on the screen. So papers are arranged in terms of similarity. So the blobs here represent a paper. The closer the blobs are, the more similar the content of the paper. The size of the node, so the size of a circle, reflects how many citations that paper has had. And the color reflects the publishing year. So darker colors are more recent, lighter colors are more in the past. And the similarity between the papers is indicated by the line. And so, what's great about this is that, in this case here, I've selected this paper in the middle, which has a black ring around it. On the right, it gives me the abstract, and I can click on it and it actually takes me to the paper. But it allows you to kind of then select other papers. So I can click on the mouse on the nearby paper, which show me the contents there. So it allows you to kind of, it allows us to interact with the papers in different ways. And it's a great way to kind of explore and find potential publishing, and sort of as you're building up your repertoire and coming up with your ideas of research, it's a really interesting and novel way of doing this. And I kind of like it because often, with a web-based search engine, you've got to kind of click through lots of different links, whereas here you can see how different ideas are linked together. Okay, so now you've got your idea of your research. Well, where do you go next? Well, next we'll come up with the method, how we're going to explore these questions. So, documenting and sharing methods is really important because it allows others to come along and potentially reproduce our work later on. And it's also very important at the evaluation stage. So later on, when researchers are peer reviewing articles and want to come back and see, well, what did they do? Well, they can better understand the research by going and seeing how it was collected and all the aspects of the method. There are ways in which open science can help here as well. So, documenting everything from the outset and keeping very detailed notes. whether this is Word files or photos or any kind of, I'm still very analog in that I still write in an old-fashioned notebook. Everything I do, I scan that, and then I upload it to Evernote. And Evernote's an open source piece of software that allows you to collect different pieces of information, whether it's on your smartphone through to a computer interface, and collect notes around different projects. So it's a very good way of collecting and organizing all the material around a particular project. Something else that's very important for us to do is to, when we publish our experiments, and I'll show you an example of this at the end of the talk, is that we can put code and notes and, manuscripts and preprints and analyses should also be available for everyone to use. And there are repositories that allow you to do this for free. And one of those is the Open Science Framework, so OSF. OSF is very useful, and I'll show you an example at the end of the talk today. But it also is in compliance with all the sort of ethics and tri-council rules. So you can actually house the data here in Montreal. There's an option to house data in Montreal. So it's a really useful resource for sort of depositing a lot of these open source materials. Obviously, since we're being open science, we try to use open source software as much as possible so that anyone then can access those materials. So I try to avoid using very proprietary, expensive software to have notes by using things like EndNote, Evernote, and other open source software for data analysis. Even it allows anyone to come along and reproduce any of our research. For data collection, there are many examples here. I've just put a few pieces of software. We use something called PsychoPy, which is a very easy to use open source piece of software for presenting any kind of auditory or visual information and recording the responses from the participants off of that. And it's a very graphic interface. It's very low, undergrads who have never programmed before can get up to speed and start programming quite complex experiments in about 20 minutes. And there's a lot of open source, it's a completely open source software. It runs on any platform, and there's lots of videos on YouTube on how to use it. So you've gone and done your experiment. You can also use open source software for analyzing your data. So you can use things like the stats package R. You could use this, which is a programming language, and a lot of researchers there's a very steep learning curve onto using R. R is very good, but it takes a long time to learn how to use. There are open source kind of equivalents of SPSS. This is called JASP or Jamovi. And these are very easy to use, click and drop analysis packages. And again, they save the data in a format which is accessible between different stats packages. So again, it's an open source way, and you can even save your data files and the analysis straight to open source platforms like the Open Science Framework. So you've done your experiment, you've done your data collection, you've done your analyses. Where do you go next? You can also, before you even start data collection, you can do open source pre-registration or registered report. So this is like the first step into publishing. And this basically, at a certain point, so you would sort of develop your idea, design your study, and then once you've come up with your sort of research question, your hypotheses, your methods, and your kind of planned analyses, you would publish these or sort of put them in a pre-registration. So the difference between pre-registration and a registered report is that pre-registration, you go through this, the steps here of developing your idea, designing your experiment, and then you then submit those ideas to a repository, and you get a kind of a timestamp when you submit this. So you can say that at that moment in time, you kind of came up with how you're planning to do your research. Then you would go out and collect the data, and you would keep yourself honest by sort of following your plan of research. So it makes our research more transparent and more open and more honest, because we're coming up with our research questions and our hypotheses before we start collecting data. Registered reports are a little bit different in that they go through a peer review process. So some journals will actually guarantee that if you go through a registered report, so here, when you would submit this, you would actually submit it to a journal. That submission goes through peer review, where they will look over your methods and your planned analyses, and if they're appropriate, some journals will publish this as a protocol, and others will then say, if you follow this plan, we will publish your findings irrespective of the outcome. So if you get a significant result or a non-significant result, if you want to use traditional hypothesis testing, then even if it were a non-significant result, they would allow the publication of that article if you followed your planned research. One common concern or criticism that researchers have is that, well, sometimes you like to explore your data as well afterwards in different ways. And both pre-registration and registered reports still allow you to do this, but that analysis should be secondary, and it should be clearly labeled as such in the final publication. And so often what we will do is say, here is our planned analysis to answer our research hypothesis. We followed it, we found significant results, we didn't find significant results, and then we say, exploratory analysis then explored the following, interesting questions that came out of this. So you can still do those exploratory analyses, but they're secondary to what had been done before. So again, some of the benefits to this are it increases the credibility of your results because you're following a predetermined plan. It allows you to make a claim of your ideas. You came up with an idea because there's a timestamp on it, so it will tell you exactly when you came up with this idea. Now, again, this is where some people are very worried about being scooped by other researchers coming in, using those materials, running the experiment faster because they have a larger lab or more money, and then doing the research before you have a chance to. And the answer to that is that when you do a pre-registration, you can either make it public, which is what happens by default, or you can make it private. So private pre-registration, it goes through the same steps. There's a timestamp that's embedded in the file, but it's not publicly available through a search engine or through searching the website. So you can still run your experiment as planned, and then afterwards you can make it from private to public whenever you feel that it's appropriate. So this avoids the complication of having your research being scooped. It also forces you to plan your project and your analyses before you start data collecting. And, this is, I would say gold standard science, where we come up with questions that we want to test before we run our experiments. And so by pre-registration or doing a registered report, it holds us to that standard. Finally, and this is kind of one I use to get my students to pre-register, you can actually win $1,000 prize, not $100,000 prize if you pre-register your research. So every month, OSF has a little draw that research that's actually been pre-registered on the site you could win $1,000. So, that's a nice little incentive that also can motivate people, not just good science, but there's a little bit of money involved if you're picked. So how do you do a pre-registration? So, you know, if you're going to do a registered reports, a lot of journals now accept them. So you'd have to go to the journal, look it up under the types of articles that they accept, and there's guidelines there. If you want to do a pre-registration, the simplest way to do that is to use a template. So there's a link here to a template that we use in my research lab for developing. So this was developed by my postdoc, Leon Franson, and I about 2 or 3 years ago now. And we use it for all our research now. And it's a very simple template. So basically you kind of fill in the boxes. And then if you go through all the steps, it'll tell you, you've now completed a pre-registration, upload this. And we use the Open Science Framework because it's free and very, very accessible. When you should pre-register is, well, ideally right before you start data collection is a good time to pre-register. You know, if you're asked by reviewers to go back and collect more data, that's also a time to revise your pre-registration. And again, you can get a revision timestamp put on the file. Or if you're beginning to analyze an existing set of data, if you're doing secondary analysis. So once you've done your pre-registration, now you've got your data. Making that data accessible is also open science. As I've mentioned already, as a scientist, you know, and as researchers, we're often limited by geography, funding, time. There's only so much research that we can do. And, you know, although we would like to recruit participants from all over the world, that's often very difficult to do. So open data allows us to analyze data from elsewhere. So we can do things like meta-analyses to compare different studies which are similar, or it allows us to do secondary analysis. So there are huge data sets out there which are, you know, which have been analyzed in one way before, but maybe not in others. And so you can kind of go out there and reanalyze data. You know, by having open data, you can, you know, putting it somewhere that's findable, having it so that there's an open license that others can reuse it is important. Something that's in this for you as a researcher is that, you know, obviously reuse of your data will give you more citations. It will increase your recognition in the field and increase the visibility of your research. Now, in other areas of science, open data is much more frequent. So three which have had a long history of open science are genetics, climate research, and machine learning. COVID has been a kind of a recent addition in the last 2 years. So there's been a lot of sharing of data between different data collection sites, different countries, which has allowed us to have a better sense of the impact of COVID, the side effects of COVID. You know, a lot of the research into long COVID and this, you know, the side effects of those who have had COVID comes from open science. And there's this great article that's published in late 2021 about how, you know, open science has really allowed researchers to, you know, develop vaccines, develop measures, and really save lives, all because data was shared between countries. So, you know, when you want to make your data open, there's a couple of steps to do. You know, good is making your stuff available on the internet. Just uploading any data in any format is a good first step. Better is if you make the data available in a table or a file and not as an image. So you could upload an image of your results. That's okay. If you can upload the actual data itself in a structured table, that's better. The best is using non-proprietary formats. So instead of using Excel, if you use what's called a CSV file, so a comma-separated value file. And this is accessible in any stats package. And then, if you can link your data to other data, then, you get the gold star. You're fantastic. And again, when you can make your data available, organize it from the start. If there are standards in your field, try and follow those standards. Obviously, de-identifying data and following ethics guidelines has to come in here. And again, I would say consult your local CRIR, CIUSSS ethics board for how to store data. Making the data available in a field-specific database or a general repository. Again, OSF is a good one here. Including the protocols, any data cleaning that you did, the analysis that you did on the data is also great as well. And then linking to the preprint or the published paper is fantastic as well. The last thing I want to end up with is, okay, so now you've gone through all this, you're ready to publish. And, this is where most people are kind of familiar with open science as an open publication. So, like I said, we've talked about preprints already. So this is the work in progress. Before you go through peer review or submitting it to a journal, you can make available a version of the file, a PDF, a Word file, whatever, on a server so that others can instantly get access to that science. The next kind of open access level is what we call postprint. So these tend to be articles which have gone through peer review, have not yet been typeset, and can be deposited in repositories such as university repositories, some of these open science repositories. This is what we call green open access. You'll see green and gold being referred to often in open access. Green open access is it's a postprint. It's gone through peer review, but it's not been typeset by a publisher. So things like student theses, sort of last versions of your manuscript, these can all be put on postprints. And then published is really what we call the gold open access level. This is published in a open access journal, so it's available for free to anyone. Usually this is in a PDF or HTML or an XML format. It has a permanent internet link. And, these are freely accessible to anyone. Usually the downside of the gold open access is that usually the researchers have to pay to have that open access journal. And this can cost between $1,000 and $10,000 depending on the journal that you're applying to. So if, something that I try to do in my research is that we try to put at least a preprints and a postprints up so that they're available for people who don't have access to the journal, or that this is an easy way for them to find. If you have questions about what your publisher lets you do, Sherpa Romeo is this British website that lets you pull up any publisher, and it will tell you what you're allowed to do with your articles from that publisher. So it will tell you if you're allowed to preprint, postprint, or have them at open access. Open access gets you cited more. And this is part of why we do it. It has bigger impact of our research. So here we're looking at the relative citation rates for articles across several fields. But if you look at, say, for example, in the medicine field, which is probably the closest to rehabilitation they have here, you can see that open access are cited 3 times more compared to non-open access journals. If we look at the number of preprints which are happening, and this is becoming very popular, then since sort of 2013, 2014, we're seeing a sharp rise in the number of publications and preprints. So more and more researchers are starting to use preprints. More and more researchers are trying to do open access. So again, this has been a kind of a whistle-stop view of open access. So what's the benefit for doing open science, especially for early career researchers, but it's also important for the rest of us. So as I said, open science has really come along, especially in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. So, but some fields are still further behind than others. So in areas like COVID research, in climate change, genomics, open access is standard. In places like rehabilitation, we're still taking very small steps. So by getting on board with open science now, you've got potential of being known as a pioneer in your field. As I said, getting higher citations, you're going to get known faster. It's a good way of demonstrating the impact of your research. So if others are using your data, using your methods, and then citing you, it shows that your research has more impact. It allows you to develop research networks and collaborations without borders. So I've had other people using my materials and analyzing data, and they've actually reached out and we've started collaborations based off of the accessibility of some of the work that we have through open science. And as I said at the very beginning of the talk, both the federal and provincial governments are increasingly requiring us to do open science. So we're all going to have to do it at some point. So some of the things I've introduced today will allow you to take some of those first steps into open science. I'll finish my slides in a second, and I'll take you to an example of the open science framework. So this is a free resource. You sign up for it. You can make your materials public or private. You can arrange your projects by author, by different projects, you can have files, links, registration. You can have a permanent reference available to that data. So it's a great resource. And as I said, you can house the data here in Montreal, so it complies with all sorts of ethics requirements as well. Today, this is a very brief introduction. You can go on an open science course for 2 weeks and still not cover everything about it. But if you want to know more about Canada and Quebec's position on open science, I've put the links in the slides there. I've also put 3 very useful links. So the Open Science Handbook is a very nice open source science book and resource in Europe, which goes into a lot of detail about the different aspects of open science. And then there's the links there for the Open Science Foundation and the Center for Open Science, both of which have resources available as well. So just to show an example of an open science type project. This is my open science home. This is a project that we ran last year from research we were doing in Lethbridge-Leighton Mackay Rehabilitation Center. So we were looking at the impact of color and illumination on reading in individuals with low vision. So you can see the contributors. So this was led by one of my graduate students, Elliot Morris, a number of the co-authors there as well, and they have links to their open science as well. We have a link here to the permanent, where the data were, this is actually published in a journal. Down here, you can see the preprint of the article. You have the analyses, the raw data in a CSV file. We have the analyses, which was run in JASP, this open source stats package. So you can download this. You have a number of figures as well, because our analysis will generate those figures, but you can also see the raw figures themselves. And then we have other types of analyses down here as well, which are all accessible. And so you can also see on this side here that it has a history of when things were edited, and it has a timestamp to say when things are. So I can go back and look at when we actually uploaded our preprint and our pre-registration, and we can point and said, well, we had this idea on this day, or at least we registered it. And so, you know, it's great as well because it generates a citation. So we can actually cite this, and it creates this permanent link, which then allows others to come and find us. So you can actually search this on Google, and it will bring you straight to this database on this page. So it's, you know, again, it's a very useful way for sharing the different parts of open science that we use in our research. And so that is it. It's a bit of a whistle stop across the different areas of open science. As I said, we could spend much longer on any one of these topics, but I'm hoping that you have a couple of ideas of how open science could be implemented in what you're doing. And it doesn't take too much changes to our behaviors to start implementing it. And there are good reasons to do this because it allows us to have a bigger impact of our research and for others to use that, and it helps our own research as well.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's so interesting. I've discovered a lot of new things today. I thought I knew a bit about it, but I have tons of questions. I don't want to take the whole time, but maybe I'll ask a tiny one. For the ethics, I'm wondering how to I've tried this, but I've seen it done both ways. Are we better off having this in our consent form, let's say, where the patient will say yes to the experiment and having his data or her data shared?
Yes.
Or it's better to have a separate form, because I've seen both, to have another form where they would consent to having the data sent to this type of database that are open source. So how do you do that?
You could do both. We tend to have it in the same consent form, so it's part of the consent process. And again, what we do is we remove any identifying information from what we store. So there, at no point do we have something that would identify the individual available with our data. Those are completely separate files for us. And so only that, the data that has no identifying information is available through Open Science Framework or any of these repositories. And we're very clear on this with our participants because it's important that they consent to us doing this. If we have questions during that process, we explain that part of why we're doing this is allows others to reuse this information for their own, for doing secondary type of questions, because we only have so much. I have so many students, or I can only have so many hours in the day for analyzing data. There are many different ways of pulling apart these data. Not only that, but others could take this and replicate that study in another country. So we actually have researchers right now who are using our methodologies in the Netherlands to run a replication of our research over there. And we're actually doing the vice versa over here with one of their research studies. So, it allows us to collect a more diverse sample of participants. And, do we get the same results? How impactful is our research, or is this just the results that we got out of our small subset of people for some reason? Just
to clarify quickly, the participant could consent to participate in the study, but not necessarily to having their data. So it's kind of two different consents. Okay, I see. Thank you.
We have a few hands up.
Yeah, I don't know who was first.
Catherine was first.
Okay.
It was wonderful, Erin. Thank you. And it was the most coherent presentation I've heard on this topic, which is particularly welcome. I guess I'm concerned about this business of getting our open source materials within 2 years in Quebec. Our non-open source materials getting available.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that? The journals have copyright issues. After 2 years, do these copyright issues just disappear into the ether? Do we have to write them? What happens with the journals?
See, this is the part that I'm still struggling with as well, is that, you know, when obviously for some journals, especially those which are often behind a paywall, we sign over our copyrights to them. So this is where that Shapiro, you know, using a preprint or a post-review manuscript and making that available is a really useful way for us to partially comply with this. So the research is getting out there. It may not look as pretty as the final published article, but the data and the contents of the science is still the same. And most journals are fine with this. Again, I would use the Shapiro, the Sherpa, sorry, tool, but to verify this. But you know, for pre-printing, we do that for everything now. And even my undergrad students who are doing their research thesis, we get them to put a preprint up. They use their thesis as a preprint because it's getting the science out there in a way that's then compliant with FRQ's requirements. Yes, it doesn't look as pretty as a final published article. That's not what FRQ is requiring of us. FRQ is saying we have to make the research accessible, which by using a preprint or a postprint and depositing either, you know, open science framework is one. Most universities have repositories as well. So everything I put on OSF, I also have to put on Concordia's repository because my institution requires it of us. But that would be in compliance. You know, the difference now is this: by removing, you know, even 12 months was pushing the border for published versions. Now, by making it immediate from March 23, it becomes something we all have to do quite early on in the process, or immediately after we get an article accepted, we have to make sure it's available. And that's going to require a change in behavior of researchers. But yeah, I completely agree that the whole question of copyright is one that has to be answered, you know, sort of looked into a lot more clearly, and guidelines have to be made available.
Thank you.
I think Ellen was next.
Yeah, so thank you very much. There's for this presentation, there's a lot that us old timers are going to have to relearn so that we can transmit it. This thing of open access and preprint and postprint, that I already knew about. But what I find really interesting in this, and it's a sort of, you talked of no negative aspects of this, but at first, when you think about open access, you're putting your data out there. And like in my field in language, there's been for a long time a database of language samples where some people never collect their data. They just always go in there. And, you know, so you wonder about the incentive for being the one to collect the data. But another thing that really strikes me about this is that at first, when you talk about open science, the thing that comes to mind is collaboration. Are we ever going to stop competing with each other? But then in the end, one thing that you talk about, be the first to register your ideas. So then I'm thinking, if I present stuff at a conference, do I have to be scared that somebody goes home and registers my idea ahead of myself? So it seems that it like just makes this requirement that we always have of be the owners of our ideas even greater.
So I'll answer the two parts. So the first part is, yes, there are, some researchers don't have access to research funds or because where they're located. So I was talking to a researcher recently in Morocco. They don't have access to a population over there as we do over here. And so they're using and reanalyzing our data in a different way. And they're citing our paper, they're citing our repository in their research. And so it's but again, you also can use that as evidence that your research is having an impact, because if others are using that material as well and are publishing, then that is showing that your research is having impact beyond the traditional citations that we normally get. For the second part, so part of this is, there's that sort of that mechanism of who gets there first. As I said, one of the easy things about things like the Open Science Framework is that you can put, I have different repositories for different projects, and I have posters up there, and I have, everything we do in the lab goes through our Open Science Framework repository, and it gets timestamped. As soon as you upload it, there's a timestamp attached to it, and there's an actual permanent URL code that's generated for that piece of that resource. So if someone else comes along afterwards and says, well, they came up with the idea first, well, we can go back and say, well, here's our preprint, or here's our published, our conference paper, and this is when we presented it.
So does that mean, are we obligated to go through everybody's thing and to make sure to check, did they possibly get the data? Two people can get similar ideas.
Yeah, they can. Yeah.
So that's what makes me even more stressed out. It's like, do I always have to be afraid that somebody claimed their idea? They may not have developed the idea very far. They just, is that healthy? Is that good for us? Competition?
It creates competition. This is where, when we're doing our ideation of research, we go through published papers. I always go through the OSF and do a quick search to see, okay, has someone done this before? And, if someone's done something and they put something in the Open Science Framework, I can look at their methods and say, okay, is this the same idea of what I had? Is it different? And if it's the same idea, then I could say, well, do I want to do a replication of this? Or do I want to say, well, I'm happy with that result, I'm going to move on to the next idea? This is, it's the hard part of I think it is the downside of open science, is that it does create this, okay, well, how do we know what other people are doing, or that some people came with these ideas first? And it's also the case that, open science is still not common. It's getting better year in, year out. But it's still a case that, some researchers are not doing this, or that, that they have this private, that you can't see what they're doing because they haven't yet made it available public. That's beyond our control, but that's beyond our control in normal research as well, because we don't know what others are doing until they've published. I've been in a case where Elliot Morris is actually a good example here. His original PhD idea was not to look at color and lighting and reading. It was to look at cognitive assessments in visually impaired. And the day he presented his thesis proposal, a paper came out that basically did the exact same project, to the letter of exactly what he had planned to do. And then we had to make a decision. In that case, we said, we're going to have to go and find a different project.
But I would argue to that, and I don't want to take all the time, but this happens all the time. And in my opinion, it isn't bad that two people, first of all, no projects are always exactly the same. There's always some difference in population or something. But it's okay that two labs do the same project, because sometimes they don't come to the same conclusion. And that's valuable.
Mm-hmm. And this is where open science helps us there, because often in journal articles, what is published in the methods section is not enough to replicate a study. Whereas in something like, if your methods and your, in some cases you can put your software up there, that others can take that and run the same software and run the study in the exact same situation. If they fail to replicate your study, then that's interesting, because you can't say, well, it's because their methodology is very different. So, right now, if you're basing your research off of a published method, you can always argue that there are differences in methodologies. But if you're using the exact same software in the exact same situation, and you're not able to replicate the results, that's really interesting. And I find that as a scientist, it's something we don't do enough in science. I could spend a whole other 2 hours talking about statistical power and sample size and p-hacking and all these other issues, especially in psychology, that we have, which lead to a lot of studies not being able to be replicated. And it's amazing how many studies are out there which are cornerstones of the field which cannot be replicated. In psychology, I don't know how many of you have heard of the marshmallow test. You put a kid in a room and you say, well, you can either have 1 marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows in 10 minutes time. And kids weigh up immediate reward versus a bigger reward later on down the line. And this is a classic study in psychology. They recently reran it and it didn't replicate. This is you can look it up. You can look at it's in every psychology textbook. It's something we teach in intro psychology, yet we can't replicate it. So I think replication is like being able to replicate someone else's results identically and find the same result or find a different result is really important, because if more labs replicate, then we can be more certain of that finding. There's this very good project that's run out here in Canada called the Many Babies Project. And this is actually trying to go back and replicate some of the classic developmental psychology studies in children, including the marshmallow test, and some are not replicated. So, maybe this is a call for us to do a many rehabilitations project where we go and take some of the cornerstone projects in rehabilitation and see, do they replicate across different countries, across different environments, across different populations.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Sorry, Ellen, just give me one second. First, I'm going to stop the recording because we don't need it now. It is